Shalom Uvracha. So we are in Hilchot Deot, the Rabbeinu Gadol Rambam, and let me share the screen. Machon Mamre edition. Hilchot Deot Perek Daled. I recall that we looked at Halacha Yud Aleph. Let's go again from Halacha Yud Aleph, where he speaks about different types of food. Rambam is discussing diet here because, as he goes on to say, presently diet is a major factor when it comes to health, which is of course something that the medical world today, even the conventional medical world today in the West, is quite happy to admit, but was not necessarily widely understood in the past. So not in Halacha Yud Aleph, which is Halacha Peth in other editions. Yesh ma'achalot shehem ra'im biyoter ad ma'od. There are certain types of food that are very harmful. A person should endeavor never to eat them. Such as large fish that was salted and kept in this way, preserved in this way for some time. As we mentioned, in a world without refrigeration, this means that this food is not fresh, even though it's salted, so it's preserved, but nevertheless it's not very fresh and therefore unhealthy. Again, Rambam is talking about something which is old, something which has been around for quite some time. Here he's speaking about salted cheese. As we mentioned last time, here speaking of mushrooms, etc., it is unclear why mushrooms are considered by Rambam here to be a food which one should never consume. Which is interesting if you consider the fact that mushrooms are mentioned in the Mishneh, the Talmud, in many places as something that was eaten, including by Hachamim, mentioned in the Talmud that ate mushrooms and liked mushrooms. It's even more surprising. So this is a little bit of a question mark. You mentioned the possibility that because there are poisonous mushrooms, in order not to be confuse one with the other, one should avoid all mushrooms, but that does not seem to be a very reasonable explanation. Again, we're talking about meat that was preserved by being salted, and it is yashan, it is not fresh. Wayain migito, which means wine which was only very recently fermented, and in fact that process of fermentation is not yet complete. With havshil sheshaha ad shenadaf recho, and any cooked dish that was left, that has been outside and has begun to smell not quite right, which of course means that it's now a breeding house, a breeding ground for all kinds of microbes and organisms that are not good for us, which is why, of course, we perceive it as having a negative odor. And any food which has a very negative smell to it or is very bitter, all these foods are literally like poison and should be therefore avoided at all costs. Halakha Yod Beth, still Halakha Teth in other editions. V'yesh ma'achalo shem ra'im, aval einam k'mu harishonoth l'ro'a. There are other types of food which are also not good and not recommended, but not as bad for you as the ones we just mentioned. Lefichach ra'ui lo adam shelo le'echol mehem ela ma'at wa'har yomim harbe. Therefore, it is correct that a person eat only a small amount of these foods and infrequently. ולא ירגיל עצמו להיות מזונות מהן או לאוכלן עם מזונות תמיד. A person should not make a habit of eating these foods regularly. We already have explained that mazon in this context and in several contexts in Chazal we see this, that the word mazon means one's staple diet or the main part of the meal. So these other foods should be eaten infrequently, such as kiron dovim gedolim, large fish. He's not talking here about a large fish that was salted and preserved and has been around for some time now, which we just learned, Rambam said, is not to be eaten at all. But any large fish, because it's caught and it takes perhaps some time until all of that fish is sold in the market. So again, it's perhaps not so fresh, therefore not to be avoided to the same extent as the one that has been around. That's been around for a long time and it's been preserved. But this too, because it's a large fish, it takes a while for such a thing. Shall we say a large tuna, which can be very large, for example, or marlin, or swordfish, or barracuda. These kinds of fish. I'm not going into the question of which of those fish might be kasher or not, but any large fish like that has there's a lot of flesh on that meat, and meat on that fish, and it takes a while to be sold. And again, this is a world without refrigeration. Ubuvina and cheese. Again, it's not clear why Rambam would consider cheese to be a food that one should not habitually eat. Again, it seems to me that it's likely to be connected to this question of refrigeration and keeping things fresh. So Rambam mentions large fish, cheese, and milk that was milked more than 24 hours ago. So again, it seems clear that Rambam is discussing foods that are not so fresh. So cheese, by definition, again, in a world without refrigeration, was made some time ago and has been out somehow for some time now, even though maybe it's only a day or two, but it's not completely fresh. And the meat of large oxen or goats, older male goats. What is particularly not good about these foods? My assumption is that it has to do with the fact that meat from an older animal is tougher and therefore more difficult to digest, and that is possibly the reason. Pol is a kind of bean. Lentils. Sapir. Sapir is also a kind of kitnif, a kind of legume. Walahem se'orim, and bread made not of wheat flour but of barley flour. Walahem musoth, and matha in general, which has been unleavened bread. Wahakiruv, this refers to cabbage. Where hasir is what we call in English leeks, which is a member of the onion family. Has a mild flavor, similar somewhat to an onion. If you're familiar with them, they're long and sort of like a large, fairly dark green tube shape, long. It's a long, tall plant. Wad the salim, onions. So he mentions them together for that reason. The word hasir, by the way, is the word mentioned already in the Torah for the leek. The Hebrew word in the Mishneh is kereshim, kereshim. In Aramaic, karatheh. And in Arabic, luf. Wahashumim, garlic. Wahabdal, which is mustard seed. Wahasthanon, which is radish. Kol elu ma'achalim ra'imhem. Rambam says here that these foods are not very good, and therefore not to be eaten in large quantities and not on a regular basis. Why this is the case with regards to beans, lentils, or shall we say bread of barley flour, frankly is unclear to me. I wonder if in this particular sefer that I have here, if they actually say something about this. No, this sefer also has nothing to add. In fact, that makes very few comments. This is the this is the part of the set of Mishneh Torah with quite a helpful be'ur written by a collection of Talmidei Chachamim, and associated with the name of Rav Steinsaltz Zatzal, although as far as I understand, he did not write the Pirush. They also say nothing on the subject, so it's not clear to me why barley bread, for example, would not be good for you. The difference between barley bread and wheat bread, to the best of my knowledge, is the level of gluten. Now today, at least, gluten is considered by some people to be undesirable or possibly problematic. Some people are in fact sensitive, and others are even allergic to gluten. That's true. But then some people are allergic to peanuts, and some people are allergic to mushrooms or to what have you, to fish. I have a grandson who is allergic to fish. So the difference between barley bread and wheat bread is a lower gluten level. Why that would be a problem, I do not know. This has to do with the fact, by the way, that the modern strain or strains of wheat, which are commonly used around the world today, is a different type of wheat from the traditional strains of wheat. In other words, the gluten content is much higher. So much of the sensitivity that we see among certain people today would probably not have been the case in the past. But that's a separate question. What is se'orim, lechem se'orim, because it has a much lower gluten content, is therefore quite literally less gluey. That is to say, it sticks together much less well. It's therefore more crumbly. Barley bread tends to crumble and hold itself together less well than bread made from wheat, precisely for that reason. And that's why it was generally not used for bread, and generally was used as animal feed, or for producing certain other products, such as beer, for example. But why it would be considered unhealthy, and was also therefore cheaper? As we see in Sefer Melachim, the price of wheat was double the price of barley, precisely for these reasons. Therefore, Chazal referred to barley being the food, the bread eaten by poor people. But why it would be considered unhealthy, frankly, I do not know. Masoth, I think we do understand. Masoth, bread that was not allowed to ferment, is more difficult to digest than fermented bread. That's one aspect of it. So it has to do with digestion. Second of all, the process of fermentation of himus, the proteins in the wheat, for example, go through a certain process, especially when the fermentation process is a natural one. In other words, dough, where sourdough, saor, was used rather than commercial wheat yeast. The process is such that the nutrients in the grain are more completely processed, and therefore they're therefore more nutritious, and also more easily digested. And in the case of masoth, it didn't go through that process, so it is less well processed in its natural sense, and also more difficult to digest. As for these vegetables, such as kereshim, that is to say, leek, onion, garlic, etc., not clear to me why these foods are considered. The Rambam lists these foods as undesirable. Again, Chazal mention almost constantly precisely these foods as foods that were commonly consumed. This is true both about the karuv, the cabbage, and the hasir, which is the leek, the thalim, shumim, hardal. All of these things, fanon, all these things were mentioned frequently as food that was eaten on a regular basis. And in fact, it is widely considered today to be these things, or some of these things are considered to be a very healthy food, such as garlic. So there are certain foods or certain statements that Rambam makes in this perek which are unclear to us, or at least I should say to myself. There may be a certain school of thought in the natural medicine world where certain practitioners might agree with precisely these statements. I'm not aware of such a thing, but it might be so. But of course, you could find others who disagree. Very well. We shall continue. Halakha Yad Gimel. This is still halakha, typed in other editions. And it is recommended that a person eat only small amounts of these foods, and more specifically in winter. But the rest of the year one should not eat of these foods at all. Again, this is difficult, it seems to me, to understand. Almost all cooked foods, or many cooked foods, and many foods perhaps also uncooked, involve or contain onion, garlic, etc. So it seems very difficult to completely avoid these things, even if one wished to do so. Paul, excuse me. Paul והעדשים בלבד אין ראוי לאוכלם, לא בימות החמה ולא בימות הגשם. As for lentils and this particular kind of bean, they should not be eaten at all, not in the winter, not in the summer. Again, a somewhat surprising statement. والدلوعيم أخلم معك بموت حما. Deloim, of course, is pumpkin, dela'af. Rambam does recommend eating small amounts of this food during the summer months. הלכה י"ד ויש מאכלות שהם רעים ואינם כמו אלו. There are other foods which are also really not very good for you, but not as undesirable or not to be avoided to the same extent. Wahen off hamayim, literally poultry, birds that live on the water. So this would include ducks and geese and the like. Uvnei yonah haketonim, and young small doves. Why the meat of these types of poultry would be considered undesirable, I frankly have no idea. Again, it should be stated that we are not discussing excuse me. Again, it should be stated that we are not discussing Torah here. We are discussing medical advice. And on certain points, I think it is true that what was considered in Rambam's day to be sound medical advice is perhaps not considered so today. There are, in fact, many instances where it's the opposite, where many things Rambam says are very much accepted by many medical practitioners today. But this is not true of every detail. So Rambam speaks here about of hamayim, uvnei yonah haketanim, and hatamarim, which are dates, of course. Olahem kalui b'shemen, olahem shenilosh b'shemen, and bread that was either after having been baked was well, kalui means roasted, but I think probably means fried in oil. Or lehem shenilosh b'shemen, or bread where oil was used in the as part of the process of the manufacture of that bread. I would assume that this is talking not about a dough where a small amount of oil was added to the dough, which is quite common practice, although not necessary. You don't need to have any oil in bread. But sometimes certain types of breads have a little bit of oil in them. I think this refers to bread where instead of water, oil was used to knead the dough. So it's very oily. והסולת שניפו אותה כל סורקה עד שלא נשאר בה ריח מורסן. This is an example of something that is widely accepted today. Rambam is speaking here about highly processed white flour. Soleth, fine white flour, where all the husk or the outer shell of the grain has been removed. This is the mursan. Mursan is the covering, the sheath, the skin, as it were, of the wheat grain. You can grind wheat in its natural form, and if you do so, that's considered 100% whole grain flour, which therefore has this shell is part of the flour, which makes the flour and therefore the bread made from such flour heavier, much heavier. Now you will hear many people today in the people who believe in certain kinds of diets will tell you that you should only eat whole grain bread. But that's not what Rambam actually says here. Rambam does not say you should eat bread that is 100% whole grain, which in my experience is not necessarily ideal. Rather, Rambam says, you should not normally, habitually eat bread made of flour that is 100% without that outer shell. So today you can purchase, as I said, 100% whole grain, or you can purchase 80%, 70%, 50%, or of course you can yourself mix different types of flour together. You can mix 100% white flour with, let's say, 20% whole grain flour, and that is what Rambam is referring to. So flour where there is some of the husk, some of the shell, or bran, is in the flour still. And this is widely accepted today. This is healthy for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are vitamins and minerals which are to be found in the bran, in that shell. If you remove all of that, you lose these nutrients. And second of all, because of the fiber content, which is necessary for healthy digestion. But again, 100% whole grain flour. My view is that it's too heavy, and there is too much bran for most people. So that's not the ideal either. Something where some bran is still present is the ideal. So it says Rambam here. Wahasir. Sir is a liquid which is the result of the liquid that one ends up with after pickling fish that has been pickled, which with water, of course you have a mixture of water and vinegar and salt and other ingredients. That liquid was used for various purposes in cooking as well. We know this also of the Romans. They also had many cooked dishes in which this kind of fish sauce or liquid was used. Rambam says this is not to be eaten in large quantities. Wahamurias. Murias comes from a Latin word, murias. And this also was something made of pickled fish, fish that was pickled in brine, salt water, or oil, or both, and other, probably vinegar as well, I imagine. And again, these things, because the origin of these substances is fish, and fish, when it is around for some time, even in pickled form, eventually goes off. It seems that is the reason why Rambam considers these things not particularly healthy. So with regards to these foods, it is best not to eat much of these foods. A person who is wise, the definition of wisdom or one of the definitions of wisdom, is that a person controls his passions and his appetites, and will therefore not be led by his more base instincts and appetites, and will therefore avoid all of these foods that we have mentioned completely, unless they were prescribed for him by a doctor for medical purposes. Gibor, such a person is to be admired as a strong-willed and not courageous, but praiseworthy, because this person is in control, and he is just making decisions and deciding what he should do, and he's not led by simply by what he finds tasty or appetizing. As Rambam said earlier, that one should not eat food simply because they're tasty, but rather because one knows that these are healthy foods as well. That it does not mean one has to eat food that is undesirable or unappetizing, but that should not be the only consideration. We continue. Halakha Tethwell, or Yod Aleph now. Le'olam yimna' adam asmo miperot ha'ilanoth. Rambam here says a person should stay away, more or less, from fruit that grows on trees. And one should not eat much of these foods, even if in their dried form, such as dried figs, dried dates. This would include, it seems, raisins, etc. And this is even more obvious if we're speaking about these fruits in their fresh state. This is another example where we cannot really explain, based on what we know today, why Rambam makes this statement. I might be able to suggest the following: fruit, all fruit essentially is high in fructose, high in natural sugars, and we know that large amounts of sugars are unhealthy. And maybe the Rambam was aware of this. How exactly he would know this, I cannot say, but perhaps Rambam saw this based on his medical practice, as his experience. Rambam does not say not to eat any of these foods, but he does say not to eat a lot of these foods, to eat them in small, limited amounts. So Rambam says, and one should not eat much of them. Again, these are foods that are mentioned in the Tanakh, and later in the Mishneh, in the Tosefta, but I thought these are foods such as figs and dates and grapes and all these foods. These are the Shivat HaMinim, as we know, the minim, the types of fruits that are mentioned specifically in the Torah, that we find in Eretz Yisrael in abundance and in high quality. Rambam says, yes, that's all very true, but that doesn't mean you have to eat large amounts of them. So perhaps the sugar content is part of that. However, these foods, these fruits, before they are completely ripe, they are literally like swords to the body. In other words, it's very unhealthy to eat fruit in general, which is not ripe. This is true of all fruits, essentially. Take bananas, for example. The starches in the banana, as it ripens, become become sugar, and that's why the banana becomes sweeter and softer. And we can see the signs. We observe the signs of this ripening process on the outside of the banana. And when it has reached that point of being completely ripe, that's when it should be consumed. Before that, these starches are difficult for the body to deal with. There is a fruit the Rambam says you should never eat, and that is what we call in English carob. This too we do not fully understand why Rambam would say this. Today, carobs are considered actually as a kind of superfood by some people. Perhaps there are strains, there are varieties of wild carob which in Eretz Yisrael, for example, grow all over the country, that are not very easy to digest, etc. Although, in my experience, this is also not necessarily the case. Carobs, of course, are a dry, hard food. It's not a soft fruit like, shall we say, grapes or fresh figs. But if you soak them in water for a time, an hour or two is usually sufficient. It softens them up, and then it's easier to eat and therefore to digest. That is my experience. So this is another point that we cannot fully explain why Rambam was of this view. It's also possible, of course, that some of these statements Rambam found in medical texts, which we know Rambam had, where some of these statements were made, and he tended to accept some of these statements, probably not all of them, but some of them. And he may have seen these things written in medical texts in his day. And all fruit that is sour, ra'in. Fruits that are sour, again, this would include, one would imagine, lemons, for example. Another fruit that we might mention here, which is not sour but bitter, which Rambam mentioned earlier, something which is very bitter, it would be something perhaps like grapefruit. Although grapefruits, the ones that I am familiar with today in Israel, are not very bitter. I remember in Chutz La'aretz, we actually had a grapefruit tree in our garden at some point, and it was a different type of grapefruit. It was very bitter. So Rambam said earlier that very bitter foods are to be avoided, and now Rambam says sour fruits and foods are also to be avoided, which is naturally the case. Most people do not sit around and just eat a lemon as it is. It's used in sparing quantities to add certain flavor to certain foods, but precisely because it is so acidic, the sourness, it has to do with the acidity. It is in large quantities. It is difficult for the body to deal with it, and therefore we naturally stay away from such a thing in large quantities. Rambam says these foods should be eaten in small quantities and only in the summer. So here Rambam says that figs and grapes and almonds, tovim le'olam, these are always healthy. So what Rambam spoke about earlier were other kinds of fruits. And this therefore answers the question perhaps that we mentioned earlier. These are some of the foods mentioned by the Torah as being Eretz Yisrael being particularly blessed with te'enim, figs, anavim, grapes, shekedim, not mentioned in the Torah, almonds, Tovim la'olam, they're always good. Ben retubim, ben yubeshim, whether fresh or dried. V'ochel adam mehem kol surko, and one can eat as much as one likes of these foods. If the reason for what Rambam said earlier has to do with high fructose content, this would not follow. This would not seem to fit that theory, because figs, but even also grapes, have very high sugar content, particularly high, in fact. So it may have something more to do with digestion. Rambam may have been of the view that certain fruits, perhaps things like apples or pears, and particularly, as he said, if they're not ripe, but even if they are ripe, should be eaten in smaller quantities. But you see, these fruits, Rambam says, are fine as much as you wish. You may eat. And yet one should not make it a constant, steady part of one's diet in large quantities, even though they are healthier than the other fruits that we mentioned. That may have to do with digestion as well, I think. If one eats large quantities of grapes, figs, etc., this can cause diarrhea. Simply, I think that's probably the reason Rambam says that. Halacha Pet Zayin or Yod Beth. Hadavash v'hayayin, honey and wine. Ra laketonim u'yafeh lazikenim. They are not recommended for children, but they are recommended for older people. And this is even more so in the winter months. What do we know about honey? From the little I know about honey, honey has many positive nutrients in it. If the honey, this needs to be stressed, if the honey is in its natural, uncooked, unheated form. All liquid honey that is easily runs, the kind of honey that most of us probably grew up with, has been heated, and during that heating process, those nutrients are destroyed. Then all you're left with is sugar. Whereas honey in its natural form, which tends not to be liquid, but solidifies, is actually healthy in small quantities, of course. With regards to wine, many types of wine, particularly red wine, and wine does not have to be sweet, of course. Wine in its natural state is not sweet. During the fermentation process, the natural sugars become alcohol, and you have in such wine antioxidants. That was a term I'm sure the Rambam never heard of, but this is known today, and antioxidants are good for you. So wine in reasonable quantities, particularly with one's food, as Rambam writes in the next perek. In other words, wine drunk by itself, without eating something along with it, can easily cause one to become tipsy or drunk, even more than a glass or two. But if with food, it does not cause inebriation, as Chazal say, and Rambam quotes in the next perek. So wine is good, particularly for older people. Some say that it is good for the heart, and it expands the arteries and allows the blood to flow more efficiently, and the antioxidants we mentioned. A person should aim to eat in terms of quantity, 2/3 of what he eats in the winter months, 2/3 of that in the summer months. This has to do with the varying needs of the body in the various seasons and the difficulty or the energy required to digest. Digestion is very requires much energy, which is why after eating a large meal we often become drowsy, because the body is spending a lot of energy digesting that meal. And therefore, it is better in general not to eat overly large quantities at one time, or in general, but particularly at one time, because then it is something of a burden on the body. It slows one down. Halacha Yod Zayin or Yod Gimel. בעולם ישתדל אדם שיהיו רפים כל ימיו. A person's aim should be that his bowels be, as Rambam writes here, should be loose always, rather than be constipated. We are karov l'shilshul ma'at, rather closer to diarrhea than the opposite. Not that diarrhea is the desirable state of affairs, but one's bowel should not be leaning in the other direction. That is not healthy. Zeh kelal gadol b'refuah, says Rambam. This is, he says, an important rule of thumb in medicine. Shekol zaman shaharai nimna or yotzeh bekoshi, when one's stools do not, one cannot evacuate one's bowels in a regular and timely fashion. Or yotzeh bekoshi, or the stools are very hard. Holaim ra'im ba'im. This leads to various maladies, and we know this to be true. So that is a general rule of thumb, Rambam says. So if a person knows that, and this can also vary from one person to another. Certain foods will cause one person to be more constipated. Another person may not be affected by that same food in the same way. So a person should also therefore regulate what he eats based on what he knows about himself. And how can one set oneself straight and achieve the correct balance when it comes to what we just discussed? If a person is somewhat constipated, even if his bowels are somewhat blocked or stopped up, if he was talking about a young person, yochal baboker maluhim shilukim methubalim b'shemen uvemuryas uvemelach belopath. One should eat in the morning, every morning, salty cooked vegetables, which are also prepared with oil or with these types of fish brine that we mentioned before. And Rambam mentioned earlier that you may be recommended to you by a doctor to consume of these foods for medical reasons. So here you have a medical reason to do so. These foods will loosen the bowels. Also, if you take terev is spinach leaves, and Rambam here mentions also kruv, cabbage, which has been thoroughly cooked. So now you have the soup, the liquid from that process is to be drunk. These things will help to loosen the bowels, says Rambam. If a person was older, Yishte devash mazul b'mayim hamim b'boker. A person should drink in the morning honey that was dissolved in hot water. V'yishhe kemo arba sha'ot, and wait 4 hours. V'ahar kach yochal seudato, and then eat his meal. In other words, do not eat until at least 4 hours after having risen and having drunk this honey in hot water. Ya'aseh ken yom ahar yom. If a person does this for a number of days, 3 or 4 days, im thorach lechach, when necessary, ad she'yirpu me'al, until his bowels will return to proper function. It should be pointed out that taradin or tarad is not spinach. It's referring to what we call in Hebrew selik alim. What's that called in English? Let me just check. The translation I have here is chard, Swiss chard, C-H-A-R-D, or mangold. Latin term is Beta vulgaris. This is a vegetable which I see it frequently nowadays. It is a leafy green vegetable. Has large green leaves, which can be eaten raw. They are used by many people in salads, etc. And they can also be boiled in water, and the water from that boiling process, that's the taradin that the Rambam refers to, not what we call spinach. That liquid is helpful for this purpose as described for dealing with constipation. Further, Rambam says in Halacha Yod Dalet, Yod Teth or Yod Dalet, V'od kolal acher amaru b'vriyut haguf. There is another important rule when it comes to general health. Kol zaman she'adam mit'amel u'yagea harbe. If a person exercises or is physically active, u'yagea harbe, quite active, we'no savea, and is not always replete in terms of having always eaten, but rather he should also allow himself to become hungry at some point. This is a general problem in the Western world. People do not allow themselves to become hungry. So a person should eat and then allow oneself to digest. And Rambam also mentioned, if you recall earlier, that one should not eat unless one is hungry. So if a person is physically active and does not overeat, and his digestion is as it should be, and he's not constipated, and he will not be ill, and he will be strong and become stronger. If you remember what I just mentioned was at the beginning of this perek, Rambam said in Halacha Beth, and this is here in Hilchot Deot perek Beth, Rambam said le'olam lo yochal adam ad ela kishu ra'ev, unless when he's hungry. V'lo yishteh ela kishu sameh, one should not eat unless one is hungry, and not drink unless one is thirsty. And then later, the next statement, the Rambam said, "Lo yochal adam ad shetith maleh kareso," one should not overeat. So, returning to where we are here, Rambam says, if a person is physically active and not all, his body is not constantly having to digest food that he has eaten, he allows himself to digest and refrain from eating for a time, and he is not constipated, he should be a healthy person. I'm sorry. And this will be true even if his diet is not ideal, even if he eats some of the foods that I recommended that one should avoid. If one is active and does not overeat and is not constipated, one will generally be healthy. On the other hand, a person who is constantly at rest and does not do any physical activity, or or a person who does not evacuate his bowels regularly as his body indicates to him that he should. This was also mentioned by Rambam at the beginning of this perek. You can see it here in the very beginning. In Halakha Beth, here you can see, after speaking about eating and drinking, he says one should not delay evacuating one's bowels, even for a moment. So in Halakha Yod Teth, if a person is not physically active, or is not regular in his habits with regards to evacuating his bowels, or or is constipated, even if he eats healthy food, and tries to look after himself based on sound medical advice, he will constantly be unwell, he will suffer aches and pains, and his strength or his energy, I would say, he will feel lack of energy. Overeating, kol adam, overeating is like poison. And this is a basic and fundamental point, and to understand, and this is a basic cause of l'chol holaim. Excuse me, l'chol holaim, all or many maladies. This, I think, would be generally accepted and applauded, in fact, by many practitioners today. So let us continue with the last statement that Rambam makes here in this perek with regards to diet. Rambam says in Halakha Kaf or Tethwal, Rov ha'holaim haba'im al ha'adam enam ela mipnei ma'achalim ra'im. Most diseases that befall most people are caused by incorrect, unhealthy diet. Enan ela mipnei ma'achalim ra'im, or mipnei shehu memale bikno, or because he overeats. Wa'ochel achila gasa, eats large amounts, too great, and this leads to various illnesses and diseases. Even if one is eating healthy food, but just the very fact of overeating is unhealthy, and these things cause most disease. So Rambam was definitely someone who, as a doctor, believed that diet is critical. To this, Shlomo referred in the Pasuk, in his wisdom, Shomer Piu Ulashono, Shomer Misaroth Nafsho. He who guards his mouth and his tongue will save himself much suffering and trouble. Kolomar, and Rambam explains, Kolomar, Shomer Piu, speaking about the mouth, one's mouth, he who guards his mouth, Bile'echol ma'achal ra o minisboa, if one guards one's mouth as a gate, as it were, so that one does not eat unhealthy foods or does not overeat, Ulashono, and one's tongue, miladaber ela bisrachal, over to speak too much, to say things that should not be said, to speak as necessary, as Rambam mentioned earlier, if you recall. Rambam said in Halacha Beth, if you recall, in Hilchot Deot, we'll read that and end with these words. In Hilchot Deot Perek Beth, Rambam writes in Halacha Heth or Daled, Le'olam yarbe adam bishtika. A person should aim generally to say little. ולא ידבר אלא או בדבר החוכמה או בדברים שצריך להם לחיי גופו. One should speak mainly about knowledge, wisdom, understanding, learning, or bidvarim shesarich lahem lahay gufo, all the things that one requires to exist and deal with one's affairs in this world on a regular basis. Omaru al Rav, it was said about Rav, Talmid Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the Talmid Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, shelo sah siha b'toila kol yamav, that he never spoke frivolously, never spoke things that do not need to be said. Wazohi sihat rov kol adam, but this is precisely what most people are saying and speaking about most of the time. The vast majority of what most people say, in fact, should never be said and does not need to be spoken of. And even that which is necessary, one should limit in terms of one's needs and requirements. And with regards to this, the Chachamim said, Kol hamarbeh devarim, he who is always chattering, mevi het, will inevitably, inexorably bring upon himself sin. Wa'amaru lo masati laguf tov ela shatika. It's in the Mishneh Masechet Avot that silence is golden. We shall stop here for today. Hizku v'yames levavchem kol ha'me'achalim l'Adonai. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.